Sometimes a man spends 30 years running from home, only to discover home was the one thing worth running back to. There's nothing quite like the bond between a father and son, even when that bond has been broken by pride, time, and words that can never be taken back. When Elias Boone walks into Bitter Ridge with his faithful dog, Sheriff Clay Dorsey sees trouble. The lawman orders the ragged stranger off the abandoned McAllister Ranch without asking questions. But Dorsey just made a big mistake. Elias isn't a drifter. He's the rightful owner of that ranch. After 30 years away, McAllister's estranged son has returned with legal papers proving the property is his. The sheriff just humiliated the man who owns half the county. What happens when pride meets truth in a small western town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana sun had a way of making everything look older than it was, and Bitter Ridge wore its age like a man who'd worked hard all his life and had the lines to prove it. Main Street stretched barely 4 blocks, lined with buildings that had seen better decades. The paint peeled from storefront signs, and more than half the windows displayed "for rent," notices that had yellowed with time and false hope. Sheriff Clay Dorsey stood on the wooden sidewalk outside his office, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, watching the morning light creep across the dusty street. At 52, he'd been wearing that badge for nearly 20 years, and in all that time, he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with a firm word and a steady stare. His father had been sheriff before him, and his grandfather before that. The Dorsey name meant something in this town. It meant order, respect, and the kind of unwavering certainty that kept folks feeling safe even when times got hard. And times had gotten plenty hard. The copper mine that once employed half the county had closed 5 years back, taking with it the steady paychecks that kept families fed and businesses thriving. Young people packed up and headed for cities with more promise than Bitter Ridge could offer. Those who stayed did so out of stubbornness, loyalty, or simply because they had nowhere else to go. Clay understood that feeling. This land had raised him, shaped him, and he'd be damned if he'd abandon it now. Someone had to keep the peace, even in a place where peace sometimes felt like all they had left. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, promising relief from the drought that had gripped the region for months. Clay adjusted his hat and walked the familiar patrol route that took him past Martha's Saloon, the First National Bank, and Doc Miller's clinic. Each building held memories, stories, and the quiet dignity of a community that refused to quit. Martha wiped down glasses behind the bar as he passed. Her silver hair caught up in the same practical bun she'd worn for as long as anyone could remember. She'd been serving drinks and dispensing wisdom in equal measure for 30 years, outlasting 3 husbands and countless economic downturns. Her establishment served as the town's unofficial meeting hall, where ranchers discussed cattle prices over coffee and old-timers shared stories that grew more colorful with each telling. "Morning, Clay," she called through the open door. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "Much obliged, Martha, but I'm making rounds." He touched the brim of his hat. "Everything quiet last night?" "Quiet as Sunday service. Though I did hear tell there's a stranger been seen out near the old McAllister place." Clay's expression tightened. The McAllister Ranch had been empty for months now, ever since the old man passed. It sat like a wound on the landscape, a reminder of better times when cattle grazed those fields and the main house welcomed visitors with warm lights spilling from its windows. Now it attracted nothing but dust, memories, and apparently vagrants looking for shelter. "I'll see to it," he said, continuing his walk. The bank stood next, its brick facade still solid, despite the economic uncertainty that had claimed so many other businesses. Harold Stevens had managed the institution for 15 years, a careful man who understood that in a small town, every loan was personal, and every foreclosure broke somebody's heart. He maintained the building with the same attention he gave his ledgers, precise, thorough, and mindful of appearances. At the end of the street, Doc Miller's clinic occupied a converted house with a wide front porch and a hand-painted sign that had weathered countless storms. Dr. Elizabeth Miller had arrived in Bitter Ridge, fresh out of medical school 25 years ago, intending to stay just long enough to pay off her student loans. Instead, she'd found herself woven into the fabric of the community, delivering babies, mending bones, and offering comfort when medicine couldn't cure what really ailed people. Clay respected her judgment above almost anyone else's. She had a way of seeing past the surface of things, of understanding the deeper currents that moved through people's lives. If anyone could help him make sense of the changes coming to their town, it would be Doc Miller. The morning patrol revealed nothing unusual. A few early risers heading to work, the mail truck making its rounds, Mrs. Henderson sweeping her porch with the methodical dedication of someone who believed cleanliness could hold back chaos. Everything appeared normal, ordered, the way Clay preferred it. But as he walked back toward his office, his thoughts kept returning to Martha's comment about a stranger near the McAllister place. Drifters weren't uncommon, especially during the warmer months when the roads became passable and desperate men sought temporary shelter. Most moved on quickly once they realized Bitter Ridge had little to offer. Still, Clay made it his business to know who was in his territory and why. The McAllister Ranch represented something more than abandoned property. It symbolized the town's past prosperity, when cattle ranching provided steady income and the future seemed secure. Old Duncan McAllister had been a fixture in the community for decades, a man whose handshake meant more than most contracts and whose word carried weight in business dealings throughout the county. But Duncan had also been stubborn, proud, and unforgiving. His falling out with his son had become local legend, the kind of family tragedy that people whispered about but never discussed openly. The boy had left 30 years ago, after a fight that shook the walls of the main house and echoed through the community for months afterward. Some said it was about money, others claimed it involved a woman, but the truth remained buried with the hurt feelings of two proud men who refused to bend. Duncan had died alone, with no family to mourn him properly and no heir apparent to claim the substantial property he'd spent a lifetime building. The lawyers were still sorting through the legal complications, but in the meantime, the ranch sat empty. A magnet for trouble, Clay climbed the steps to his office, the wooden boards creaking under his boots. The building had served as the sheriff's headquarters for 60 years, and every Dorsey who'd worn the badge had left his mark on its character. Clay's grandfather had installed the gun rack that still held 3 rifles. His father had added the filing cabinets that contained decades of incident reports, most of them documenting minor disputes and occasional cattle theft. Clay had contributed his own touches, a new desk, better lighting, and a detailed map of the county marked with property boundaries and known trouble spots. The McAllister Ranch occupied a prominent position on that map, its borders clearly defined and its strategic importance obvious to anyone who understood land and water rights in this part of Montana. He poured coffee from the pot he'd started before his morning walk and settled at his desk to review the paperwork that seemed to multiply regardless of how quiet the town remained. Budget reports, maintenance requests, correspondence from the state, the administrative side of law enforcement that nobody talked about but consumed far more time than chasing criminals. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way he preferred it, and the familiar routine of morning paperwork usually helped him focus his thoughts and plan his day. But today felt different somehow, as if something in the air warned of changes coming whether he welcomed them or not. Through his office window, he could see the mountains that ringed the valley, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the summer heat. Those mountains had sheltered this community for generations, providing water, timber, and a sense of permanence in an uncertain world. They'd witnessed the arrival of the first settlers, the boom years of mining and ranching, and now the slow struggle to survive in an economy that seemed to have forgotten places like Bitter Ridge. Clay finished his coffee and checked his watch. Time to drive out to the McAllister place and see what kind of trouble had found its way onto his territory. In his experience, problems rarely solved themselves. and strangers who avoided contact with local law enforcement usually had reasons worth investigating. He locked the office behind him and walked to the patrol car parked in the shade of an old cottonwood tree. The vehicle had seen better years, but it ran reliably and served his purposes. In a county this size, a sheriff spent more time driving than walking, covering vast distances between scattered ranches and remote locations. Where help might be needed, the drive to the McAllister Ranch took 20 minutes along roads that stretched straight to surveyors' lines across the high plains. The land rose and fell in gentle swells, covered with sagebrush and native grasses that had adapted to the harsh climate and uncertain rainfall. Cattle had once grazed these fields, in numbers that impressed visiting buyers from back east. Now the pastures lay empty, slowly returning to their wild state. As he approached the ranch buildings, Clay could see smoke rising from the main house chimney, a sure sign that someone had made themselves at home without permission. The sight irritated him more than it should have. This wasn't just about trespassing. It was about respect for property, for the memory of a man who'd built something substantial in this unforgiving country. He parked near the front gate and studied the scene before getting out of the car. A figure sat on the porch steps, and beside him lay a dog, a large, mixed-breed animal with the kind of intelligent eyes that suggested it had seen plenty of hard country. The man appeared to be in his 50s, weathered by sun and wind, dressed in clothes that had been mended more than once. His hair was long and grey, his beard trimmed but full. Clay approached with the measured pace he'd learned from years of dealing with potentially volatile situations. Most problems could be solved with a calm voice and clear expectations. People responded to authority when it was presented firmly, but without unnecessary aggression. "Morning," he called out, stopping about 10 feet from the porch. "I'm Sheriff Dorsey. Mind if I ask what brings you to this property?" The stranger looked up without hurry, his gaze steady and untroubled. There was something familiar about his face, though Clay couldn't place where he might have seen it before. The man's hands rested easily on his knees, and the dog remained calm, watching the exchange with alert but not aggressive interest. "Just resting," the man said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to solitude. "Didn't figure it would cause harm, place being empty and all. Property's still owned, even if nobody's living here regular," Clay replied, keeping his tone level. "Owner might not appreciate visitors making themselves comfortable without asking permission first." The stranger nodded slowly, as if considering this perspective. "I suppose that's true enough. Though I wonder if the owner would mind as much as you might think." Something in the man's tone suggested layers Clay couldn't quite interpret. He stepped closer, studying the stranger's face more carefully. There was definitely something familiar about those features, though the beard and long hair made identification difficult. "You got a name?" Clay asked. "Elias Boone," the man replied without hesitation. The name meant nothing to Clay, which was unusual in a county where he knew most residents and their families going back generations. Boone. No Boones had ever lived in this area, at least not that he could recall. "Where you from, Mr. Boone?" "Up in the mountains mostly. Been living quiet for some years now." That explained the weathered appearance and self-contained manner. Mountain men were a breed apart, men who'd chosen solitude over society and learned to depend on themselves above all others. Clay had encountered a few over the years, usually harmless individuals who preferred isolation to the complications of community life. "Well, Mr. Boone, I'm going to have to ask you to move along. This property is not available for camping, and the owner wouldn't appreciate strangers making themselves at home." Elias Boone stood slowly, his movements careful but not deferential. The dog rose with him, stretching with the casual confidence of an animal accustomed to following its master's lead. There was no challenge in the gesture, but neither was there any sign of intimidation. "I understand your position, Sheriff," Boone said, shouldering a worn pack that had seen considerable use. "Though I expect there might be some confusion about the ownership situation." Before Clay could ask what he meant, the stranger whistled softly to his dog and began walking toward the road. They moved with the unhurried pace of people accustomed to traveling on foot, covering ground efficiently without appearing to rush. Clay watched them go, troubled by something he couldn't quite identify. The encounter had gone smoothly enough. No arguments, no resistance, no threats or complications. Yet something about Elias Boone lingered in his memory, like a half-remembered song. He stood on the porch where the stranger had been sitting and looked out across the ranch with new eyes. The property stretched for miles, encompassing some of the best grazing land in the county. Duncan McAllister had been justifiably proud of what he'd built here, and his absence left a void that felt almost physical. The main house stood solid and well-built, constructed from local stone and timber by craftsmen who understood how to create structures capable of weathering Montana's harsh climate. Duncan had spared no expense in its construction, and despite months of abandonment, the building retained its dignity. Clay tried the front door and found it unlocked, which surprised him until he remembered that Duncan had rarely bothered with locks. In the community where everyone knew everyone else, security had been more about reputation than physical barriers. Inside, the house felt like a museum dedicated to a way of life that was slowly disappearing. Duncan's furniture remained in place, heavy, practical pieces built to last generations. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, documenting decades of McAllister history in formal poses and candid moments. One photograph caught Clay's attention, a picture of Duncan as a younger man, standing beside a boy who appeared to be in his late teens or early 20s. Both men wore serious expressions, but there was unmistakable pride in their postures. Father and son, captured in a moment before whatever tragedy had driven them apart. Clay studied the young man's face and felt a chill of recognition. Remove 30 years of weather and hardship, add a beard and longer hair, and the features would match those of the stranger he'd just encountered. The photograph seemed to mock his certainty about property rights and proper procedures. If his growing suspicion proved correct, he'd just ordered the rightful owner off his own land. Clay stood in Duncan McAllister's living room for a long time, staring at that photograph and feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. 30 years could change a man considerably, but bone structure remained constant. The eyes stayed the same, and those eyes steady, thoughtful, carrying depths that spoke of experiences beyond ordinary understanding. Those eyes belonged to the stranger he'd just run. Off the property, he set the frame back on the mantelpiece, with hands that weren't quite steady. In 20 years of wearing a badge, he'd made his share of mistakes, but none that cut quite this deep. A sheriff's authority rested on knowledge, on understanding his territory and the people who moved through it. Today, that authority felt as fragile as old paper. The drive back to town passed in a blur of self-recrimination and growing dread. Word traveled fast in small communities, and by now, half of Bitter Ridge probably knew he'd confronted some vagrant at the McAllister place. The other half would know before supper time. What they didn't know, what he was only beginning to suspect, was that the vagrant might have more right to be there than anyone else in the county. Main Street looked the same as always, but Clay saw it through different eyes now. The comfortable certainty that had guided his decisions for 2 decades felt suddenly fragile. He parked outside his office and sat for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts and figure out his next move. The sound of a car engine made him look up. A black sedan with city plates pulled up across the street, and a man in an expensive suit climbed out, consulting a piece of paper before walking directly toward the sheriff's office. Lawyers had a particular look about them, confident, purposeful, carrying briefcases that contained other people's fates. This one fit the description perfectly. Sheriff Dorsey? The man extended a manicured hand. I'm Robert Harrison from Harrison Mitchell and Associates in Billings. I wonder if I might have a word with you about a legal matter. Clay shook the offered hand and gestured toward his office door. Come on inside, Mr. Harrison. What can I do for you? The lawyer settled into the chair across from Clay's desk and opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency. I'm here regarding the estate of Duncan McAllister. Specifically, I'm looking for his son, Elias McAllister. I understand he may have been seen in the area recently. The words hit Clay like a physical blow. His worst suspicions confirmed, he struggled to maintain professional composure. What makes you think Elias McAllister is in Bitter Ridge? Our investigators tracked him to this general region. He's been living under the name Boone for the past 30 years. Elias Boone. Mountain man, keeps to himself, travels with a dog. Harrison consulted his notes. We have reason to believe he may have come here to claim his inheritance. Clay's throat felt dry. What inheritance would that be? The entire McAllister ranch, plus liquid assets totaling approximately $2.3 million. Harrison's expression remained neutral, but there was satisfaction in his voice. Duncan McAllister died 6 months ago, and despite their estrangement, he never changed his will. Elias is the sole beneficiary. The office seemed to shrink around Clay as the implications settled in. Not only had he humiliated himself by ordering a property owner off his own land, but he'd done it in front of a man who was now worth millions. The story would spread through the community like wildfire, and his reputation would never recover. There's more, Harrison continued, apparently oblivious to Clay's distress. I have a letter here that Duncan McAllister wrote shortly before his death. It's addressed to his son, and I'm instructed to deliver it personally, along with the legal documents establishing ownership. He withdrew an envelope from his briefcase, yellowed with age and sealed with wax. The careful handwriting on the front read simply, "For Elias when he comes home." Clay stared at the envelope, recognizing Duncan's precise penmanship. Whatever words lay inside had been waiting months for their intended recipient, carrying the weight of a father's final thoughts about a son he'd driven away 30 years ago. Have you seen this Elias Boone? Harrison asked. Or Elias McAllister, as he should properly be called. The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Clay could lie, could claim ignorance and buy himself time to figure out how to handle the situation. But his father had raised him to face problems directly, and his grandfather before that. The Dorsey name stood for honesty, even when honesty came at considerable personal cost. I saw him this morning, Clay admitted. Ordered him off the McAllister property for trespassing. Harrison's eyebrows rose. You what? He was camping on the ranch. I didn't know who he was. He gave his name as Elias Boone. I told him to move along. Clay felt heat rising in his cheeks. If I'd known he was the owner, well, this is certainly awkward, Harrison said, though his tone suggested he found the situation more amusing than problematic. Do you know where he went? He was on foot, headed toward the mountains. Could be anywhere by now. Clay stood and walked to the window, needing movement to contain his agitation. This is going to cause quite a stir in town. I imagine it will. A man returning from the dead, so to speak, to claim a substantial inheritance. It's the stuff of novels. Harrison began repacking his briefcase. I'll need to find him, of course. The legal proceedings can't be completed without his signature on numerous documents. Clay turned from the window. Mr. Harrison, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me handle this situation. I know the territory and I know how to find him. More importantly, I owe the man an apology. The lawyer considered this request. Very well, Sheriff, but time is somewhat of the essence. The estate can't remain in limbo indefinitely, and there are tax implications to consider. How long do you think it might take? Give me a few days. If he's still in the area, I'll find him. After Harrison left, Clay sat alone in his office, staring at the envelope that contained a dead man's words to his estranged son. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical burden. In trying to protect property rights, he'd violated the most basic principle of his profession. Know your facts before taking action. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, each eager to discuss the morning's events at the McAllister place. News traveled with remarkable speed in small communities, and by closing time, Clay had fielded dozens of questions about the stranger he'd confronted. Each conversation added another layer to his embarrassment. Martha was the last to arrive, bringing coffee and the kind of direct honesty that made her both valued and feared in equal measure. So, she said, settling into the visitor's chair with the confidence of someone who'd known Clay since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Word is, you ran Duncan's boy off his own property. Word travels fast. Word always travels fast when it involves a Dorsey making a fool of himself in public. She studied his face with sharp eyes. You really didn't recognize him? Clay shook his head. 30 years changes a man. He was barely more than a boy when he left. I remember that fight, Martha said quietly. Whole town heard it. Duncan was so proud, so certain he was right. And Elias was just as stubborn, just as sure his father was wrong. Two bulls in the same pasture, neither willing to back down. What was it about? Really? Martha sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Pride, mostly. Duncan wanted Elias to settle down, take over the ranch, carry on the family name. Elias wanted to see the world, make his own mistakes, find his own path. Neither one could understand the other's point of view, and now Duncan's dead, and his son's been living in the mountains like a hermit for 30 years. Makes you wonder what might have been different if they'd found a way to talk instead of shout. Martha set down her cup. You going after him? As soon as I figure out where to look. Try the old line shack up on Copper Creek. If he's planning to stay in the area, that's where he'd go. It's isolated enough for a man who's been living alone, but close enough to the ranch that he could keep an eye on things. Clay nodded his thanks. Martha's knowledge of local geography was encyclopedic, and her instincts about people were rarely wrong. After she left, he sat in the growing darkness, thinking about fathers and sons, pride and forgiveness, and the terrible weight of words that could never be taken back. Somewhere in the mountains above Bitter Ridge, a man was making his own decisions about whether to claim his birthright or disappear, again into the wilderness that had sheltered him for 3 decades. Clay locked the office and walked home through streets that seemed different somehow, charged with the possibility of change. Tomorrow he would drive up to Copper Creek and attempt to repair the damage his mistake had caused. Tonight he would wrestle with the knowledge that even good intentions could lead to profound humiliation when they weren't tempered with wisdom. The envelope from Duncan McAllister lay locked in his desk drawer, waiting for its intended recipient. Whatever words the old rancher had written to his son, they represented a final chance for understanding between 2 proud men. Clay just hoped he hadn't destroyed that chance with his officious certainty and misplaced sense of duty. In the distance, the mountains stood like silent sentinels against the star-filled sky, keeping their secrets and sheltering their own. Dawn came cold and clear, with frost covering the windshield of Clay's patrol car, and his breath forming small clouds in the thin mountain air. He'd been driving for 2 hours, following logging roads and cattle trails that hadn't seen much use since the mine closed. Martha's suggestion about the Copper Creek line shack made sense. It was the kind of place a man seeking solitude would choose, far enough from civilization to ensure privacy, but still accessible to someone who knew the country. The road wound steadily upward through stands of pine and aspen, the trees showing the first hints of autumn color despite the early season. Clay had always found peace in these mountains, but today the familiar landscape felt charged with uncertainty. Somewhere ahead, if Martha was right, waited a conversation that could define the rest of his career and reputation. He'd spent most of the sleepless night rehearsing apologies and explanations, trying to find words that might bridge the gap his mistake had created. But every version sounded hollow in his own ears. How do you apologize to a man for treating him like a criminal on his own property? How do you explain that good intentions had led to such a fundamental failure of judgment? The line shack appeared around a bend in the trail, exactly where Martha had said it would be. Built from local logs and designed to shelter cowboys during roundup season, it had weathered decades of mountain storms and remained sound despite years of minimal maintenance. Smoke rose from its chimney, and Clay could see a figure moving around outside, a tall man with gray hair accompanied by a large dog. Clay parked 50 yards away and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. Through the windshield, he could see Elias McAllister, going about the quiet business of morning camp maintenance. The man moved with the efficient economy of someone accustomed to solitude. every action purposeful and unhurried. When Clay climbed out of the patrol car, the dog looked up with alert interest, but showed no signs of aggression. Elias continued his work for a few seconds before straightening and turning to face his visitor. His expression was calm but guarded, the look of a man who'd learned to be cautious about unexpected company. "Sheriff Dorsey," Elias said by way of greeting, his tone neutral. "Bit early for social calls, isn't it?" Clay approached slowly, his hands visible and relaxed. "Mr. McAllister, I owe you an apology. A considerable one." The use of his real name caused Elias to pause, a flicker of something, surprise, resignation, perhaps relief, crossing his weathered features. "So you know, a lawyer named Harrison came looking for you yesterday. Told me about your father's will, about the inheritance." Clay stopped about 10 feet away, respecting the invisible boundary that solitary men maintained around their personal space. "I made a serious mistake yesterday, and I'm here to try to make it right." Elias studied him for a long moment before gesturing toward a fallen log that served as a makeshift bench. "Coffee's hot if you want some. Not fancy, but it's strong." The offer surprised Clay. Most people he'd wronged weren't quite so quick to extend hospitality. He accepted gratefully, and Elias poured steaming coffee from a battered pot into 2 metal cups. "Been a long time since anyone called me McAllister," Elias said, settling onto another section of the log. "Started to think I'd left that name behind for good. Why did you?" "Leave it behind, I mean." Elias sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Sometimes a man needs to become someone else to figure out who he really is. Elias Boone was my mother's maiden name. Seemed fitting when I decided to disappear into these mountains. Your father never stopped hoping you'd come back." "Is that what he told folks?" There was no bitterness in the question, just curiosity tinged with old sadness. Clay chose his words carefully. "He never talked about you much, but the lawyer mentioned he never changed his will. Left everything to you despite the fact that we parted on the worst possible terms," Elias finished. "Despite the fact that I told him I never wanted to see him or that ranch again." The dog, which had been lying quietly nearby, got up and padded over to rest its head on Elias's knee. The gesture was clearly a comfort ritual, something the animal had done countless times when its master needed reassurance. "What was the fight about?" Clay asked. "If you don't mind me asking." Elias was quiet for so long that Clay began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 decades of regret. "I was 22, full of myself, and certain I knew better than the old man about everything. He wanted me to marry Sarah Henderson, settle down, start producing grandchildren. Had it all planned out, I'd take over day-to-day operations of the ranch, and he'd gradually step back into an advisory role." Clay knew the Henderson family. Sarah had married a banker from Billings and moved away years ago. She now had grown children and grandchildren of her own. "And you didn't want that life?" "I didn't want anyone else making my choices for me. Told him I was leaving for a while, maybe going to college, seeing what else the world had to offer. He said, if I walked out that door, I shouldn't bother coming back." Elias scratched the dog behind the ears. "So I didn't. For 30 years. For 30 years." Elias met Clay's eyes directly. "Stubborn runs in the McAllister blood, Sheriff. We're not quick to forgive, and we're slower to forget." Clay set down his coffee cup and withdrew the envelope Harrison had entrusted to him. "Your father wrote you a letter before he died. The lawyer asked me to deliver it." Elias stared at the envelope as if it contained a live snake. His name was written on it in the careful script Clay remembered from Duncan's business correspondence. Formal, precise, carrying the weight of important words. "I'm not sure I'm ready for whatever he had to say. Maybe he wasn't either when he wrote it. But he wrote it all the same." Clay stood up, leaving the envelope on the log between them. "That's between you and him, Mr. McAllister. I just wanted to deliver it and apologize for yesterday." "Apology accepted, Sheriff. We all make mistakes." Clay started toward his car, then stopped and turned back. "For what it's worth, your father was respected in this community. People looked up to him, trusted his word, valued his judgment. But I think he was lonely these last years, especially after he got sick cancer. Doc Miller did what she could, but it had spread pretty far by the time he finally came in for treatment. He faced it the same way he faced everything else, straight on. Without complaint, Elias absorbed this information silently, his gaze fixed on the envelope that contained his father's final words. "The ranch needs work," Clay continued. "They've been empty for months now, stock sold off, equipment gathering dust. But the bones are good, land, buildings, water rights. It could be brought back to life by someone who understood its value. Someone like me, you mean? Someone like you." Clay drove back down the mountain with mixed feelings. He'd delivered the apology and the letter, done what he could to repair the damage caused by his hasty judgment. But he couldn't shake the feeling that larger forces were now in motion, that Elias McAllister's return would change Bitterridge in ways none of them could predict. The envelope remained on the log where he'd left it, waiting for a son to finally hear his father's voice one last time. The sun was high overhead when Elias finally picked up the envelope. His hands, weathered by 3 decades of mountain living, trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal his father had pressed there months ago. Inside, he found 2 pages of the careful handwriting he remembered from childhood, the same script that had filled out his school enrollment forms and signed permission slips for church picnics. The letter began simply, "Son, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've come home at last." Elias read it through twice before the words fully settled in his mind. Duncan McAllister had written with the honesty that comes to men facing their own mortality, stripping away the pride and stubbornness that had defined their last conversation 30 years ago. "I was wrong to give you that ultimatum. A father should guide his children, not trap them with impossible choices. You were right to want to see the world, to make your own mistakes, to become your own man. I was too frightened of losing you to realize I was driving you away. The cancer doc says I have maybe 3 months. Part of me hopes you'll come back before then, so we can talk proper, but I know you well enough to suspect you won't. You always were proud as Lucifer, just like your old man. So I'm writing this instead, trying to find words for things I should have said 30 years ago. The ranch is yours, as it should have been all along. Do with it what seems right to you. Keep it, sell it, burn it down. I won't be around to complain either way. But know that every day you were gone, I walked these fields and remembered teaching you to ride, to rope, to read the weather in the clouds. This land holds the best parts of both of us, son. I hope that counts for something. Your mother always said I had too much pride for my own good. She was right about that, like she was right about most things. I'm sorry I couldn't swallow that pride long enough to bring you home while there was still time for us to be father and son again, instead of just 2 stubborn fools nursing old grievances. Be well. Elias, be happy. Be the man I raised you to be, not the man I tried to force you to become. Your father, Duncan McAllister. Elias folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. The dog, sensing his master's emotional state, pressed closer and rested its head on his lap. For a long time, they sat in the mountain silence, while Elias wrestled with feelings he'd spent 30 years trying to bury. The afternoon brought visitors he hadn't expected. He heard vehicles approaching long before they came into view. The sound carried clearly in the thin mountain air. 2 trucks wound up the trail, moving slowly over the rough terrain. The first truck belonged to Martha from the saloon. Elias recognized her immediately, despite the years that had passed. She climbed out with the same purposeful energy he remembered from his youth, carrying a basket that smelled like fresh bread and coffee cake. "Elias McAllister," she said, as if 30 years hadn't passed since their last conversation. "You look like hell, but I suppose that's what mountain living does to a man." The second truck disgorged Doc Miller. Older now, but still moving with the brisk efficiency that had made her the most trusted medical professional in 3 counties. Behind her came Harold Stevens from the bank, looking uncomfortable in his city clothes, but determined to be part of whatever was happening. "Word gets around fast in small towns," Martha explained, unpacking her basket on a makeshift table formed by a flat boulder. "Figured you might appreciate some civilized food and friendly faces." Doc Miller studied him with the professional eye she'd trained on his scrapes and childhood ailments decades ago. You've aged well, considering. Mountain Air agrees with you, though I suspect your diet could use improvement. Harold Stevens cleared his throat nervously. Mr. McAllister, I hope you don't mind my coming along. The bank holds the mortgage papers on several properties your father owned, and there are some financial matters that will need attention once the estate is settled. Elias accepted their presence with the patience he'd learned during his years of solitude. These people had been part of his childhood, fixtures in the community that had shaped his early years. Their willingness to seek him out suggested a generosity of spirit he hadn't expected. I appreciate you all coming up here, he said simply, though I'm not sure yet what my plans are regarding the inheritance. Martha fixed him with the direct stare that had quelled more than one rowdy customer in her saloon. Your plans are your business, Elias, but your father's death left a hole in this community that hasn't been filled. He was more than just a rancher. He was someone people looked to for stability, for wisdom, for the kind of steady presence that keeps a town from falling apart. I'm not my father, Elias replied. I've been living alone in these mountains for 30 years. I'm not sure I remember how to be part of a community. Doc Miller unpacked a thermos of coffee and began pouring it into cups she'd brought for the purpose. Community isn't something you remember, Elias. It's something you choose every day in small ways and large ones. Harold Stevens nodded agreement. The town's been struggling since the mine closed. Young people leave for the cities, businesses close, hope gets scarce. But land like your father's ranch, that's permanent value. It could anchor economic recovery if it's developed thoughtfully, or it could be sold to developers who will carve it up into vacation homes for rich folks from back east, Martha added tartly. Money in the short term, but the end of everything that made this place worth living in. Elias sipped the coffee Doc Miller had poured, thinking about the weight of expectations these good people were placing on his shoulders. 30 years ago, he'd fled this very burden, the responsibility of carrying on family traditions and community obligations. Now those same responsibilities were finding him even in his mountain retreat. The letter from your father, Doc Miller said gently. I assume Sheriff Dorsey delivered it? Elias nodded, patting the envelope in his shirt pocket. Duncan showed it to me before he sealed it, she continued. Asked me to read it over, make sure he'd said what he meant to say. It was important to him that you understand how he felt about the way things ended between you. He apologized, Elias said quietly. After all these years, he apologized. Pride is an expensive luxury, Martha observed. Your father paid its price for 30 years. Question is, are you going to keep paying it, or are you ready for something different? The question hung in the mountain air like smoke from their small fire. Below them, the valley stretched away toward Bitter Ridge, the ranch buildings visible as tiny squares of human habitation in the vast landscape. Somewhere down there, lawyers and bankers were preparing paperwork that would transfer ownership of substantial assets to a man who'd spent 3 decades avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility. But responsibility, Elias was beginning to understand, had a way of finding a person, whether they wanted it or not. The only choice was how to carry it, with grace or resentment, wisdom or stubbornness, isolation or community. 3 days later, Elias walked through the front door of his childhood home for the first time in 30 years. The key had been exactly where his father always kept it, under the loose board on the back porch, despite Sheriff Dorsey's assurances that Duncan rarely bothered with locks. Some habits apparently never changed. The house felt like a museum of his former life. Furniture stood in the same positions he remembered, and many of his mother's decorative touches remained untouched by the decades. Duncan had preserved the home as if waiting for his family to return at any moment. Though his wife had been dead 15 years, and his son had been gone twice as long, Elias moved through the rooms slowly, his dog padding silently beside him. In the kitchen, his mother's cast-iron pans still hung from hooks beside the stove. Her recipe box sat on the counter, filled with handwritten cards that bore the ingredients for Sunday dinners and holiday meals, that had filled this house with warmth and laughter. The living room held the most powerful memories. The stone fireplace, where Christmas stockings had hung each December. The bookshelf filled with volumes his father had collected over a lifetime. Agricultural journals, local histories, novels his mother had loved. And everywhere, photographs that documented the McAllister family through generations of Montana, ranching. But it was his old bedroom that stopped him. Cold, Duncan had left it exactly as it had. In the morning, Elias packed his few belongings and stormed out. The same faded quilt covered the narrow bed. The same collection of arrowheads lined the windowsill, artifacts from his boyhood explorations of the ranch. Even his high school trophies remained on the dresser, gathering dust, but perfectly arranged. On the small desk beside the window sat a leather-bound journal Elias recognized immediately. He'd kept a diary during his teenage years, recording his thoughts about ranch work, his dreams of seeing the world beyond Montana's borders, and his growing frustration with his father's expectations. He opened it to a random page and found an entry from his 19th birthday. "Dad gave me a new saddle today. Hand-tooled leather with silver conchos, the kind of gear a man could use his whole life. Beautiful work, probably cost more than most people make in a month. But when I thanked him, he said it wasn't a gift, it was an investment in my future as a rancher. Everything with him comes back to the ranch, to carrying on the family name, to being what he thinks I should be, instead of what I want to become." The words carried an echo of youthful anger and frustration that seemed almost foreign to him now. At 19, he'd seen his father's expectations as chains designed to bind him to a life he hadn't chosen. At 52, with 30 years of solitude behind him, those same expectations looked more like love, expressed in the only way Duncan McAllister knew how. He closed the journal and walked to the window that looked out over the ranch buildings. The barn needed new shingles, and several sections of fencing showed obvious neglect. But the bones were good, as Sheriff Dorsey had said. With work and investment, the ranch could be restored to its former productivity. The sound of vehicles approaching drew his attention to the front yard, where a convoy of trucks was pulling up to the house. Clay Dorsey climbed out of the lead vehicle, followed by several men Elias recognized as local ranchers and business owners. They moved with the purposeful air of people who'd come to discuss serious matters. Elias met them on the front porch, the same spot where he'd sat 3 days ago when the sheriff had ordered him off his own property. The irony wasn't lost on any of them, and Clay had the grace to look embarrassed as he approached. "Mr. McAllister, we were hoping we could have a word with you about some community matters." "I'm listening," Elias replied, settling into one of the rocking chairs his parents had placed on the porch for evening conversations. The dog took its customary position at his feet. The delegation included Tom Bradley, who owned the largest spread adjacent to the McAllister Ranch, and Jim Morrison, whose family had run cattle in the valley for 4 generations. Harold Stevens had returned from their mountain meeting, and behind him stood several other faces Elias half remembered from his youth. Tom Bradley spoke first, his weathered hands turning a battered hat as he chose his words. "Elias, we've got ourselves a situation developing, and we're hoping you might be willing to help us address it." "What kind of situation?" "Outside interests," Jim Morrison said, his voice carrying the distrust ranchers reserved for anyone who hadn't been born to the land. "Development company out of Denver has been buying up properties throughout the county. Paying cash, above market value, no questions asked." Harold Stevens nodded grimly. 3 ranches sold in the past 6 months, plus the old mining claims up on Copper Ridge. The buyers aren't interested in cattle or agriculture. They're talking about luxury resort development. Vacation homes, maybe even a ski resort. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And you think they're interested in my father's land?" "Your land now," Clay corrected. "And yes, we think they're very interested. Best water rights in the county, prime building sites with mountain views, direct access to national forest boundaries. It's exactly what they're looking for." Tom Bradley leaned forward, his expression earnest. Thing is, Elias, your ranch sits right in the middle of the valley. If it gets developed, it changes the character of everything around it. Property taxes go up, water rights get complicated, and pretty soon the families that have ranched here for generations can't afford to stay. How long have you known about this? Couple of months, Harold admitted. Company called Apex Development has been sending representatives through the area, making quiet inquiries. They approached me about financing options for property acquisition. When I asked around, I discovered they'd already made offers on several spreads. Jim Morrison spat into the dust beside the porch. Vultures is what they are, coming in here with their city money, trying to turn working ranch land into playgrounds for rich folks. Elias absorbed this information silently. The irony was sharp. He'd inherited property that represented everything he'd once tried to escape. And now that same property was under threat from the kind of development that would destroy its agricultural heritage permanently. What exactly are you asking me to do? Clay stepped forward. Stay, Elias. Keep the ranch as a working operation. Your father's land anchors the whole valley. If you hold on to it, the development pressure eases considerably. And if I don't? The men exchanged uncomfortable glances before Tom Bradley answered. Then we'll probably all be selling out within 5 years. Can't compete with the property taxes and water costs that come with resort development. Elias looked out over the fields where he'd learned to ride, to work cattle, to understand the rhythms of agricultural life. 30 years ago, he'd seen this land as a prison. Now it might be the key to preserving a way of life that was disappearing throughout the West. I need time to think about this, he said finally. Of course, Clay replied. But don't take too long. Word is that Apex Development has deep pockets and aggressive timelines. If they decide to make you an offer, it'll probably be substantial enough to tempt anyone. After the delegation left, Elias sat alone on the porch as evening shadows stretched across the valley. His dog dozed at his feet, content to be anywhere his master was. The decision facing him felt enormous, not just about money or land, but about identity, community, and the kind of man he wanted to be in the years he had left. His father's letter rested in his shirt pocket, its words about pride and forgiveness taking on new meaning in light of the day's revelations. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier service that charged more for the privilege than most folks in Bitter Ridge made in a day. Elias found it slipped under his front door when he returned from checking the condition of the ranch's water pumps, a task that had revealed both the extent of neglect and the solid engineering his father had invested in the property's infrastructure. The envelope bore the crisp logo of Apex Development Corporation, and inside, printed on expensive letterhead, was an offer that made Elias sit down hard in his father's old recliner. $12 million, cash, 30-day close. No inspections, no contingencies, no questions asked. He read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new details that demonstrated how thoroughly Apex had researched the property. They knew about the water rights, the mineral claims his grandfather had filed in the 1920s, even the exact acreage of prime building sites with unobstructed mountain views. This wasn't a speculative offer. It was the result of careful analysis by people who understood land values better than most. The dog, sensing his master's tension, padded over and rested its chin on the arm of the chair. Elias scratched behind its ears absently while his mind wrestled with numbers that dwarfed anything he'd ever contemplated. $12 million would buy a different kind of freedom than the one he'd found in the mountains. He could disappear completely, live comfortably anywhere in the world, never again worry about money or obligations or the weight of other people's expectations. It was more than he'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to make the next phase of his life whatever he wanted it to be. But as he sat in his father's chair, surrounded by the accumulated memories of 4 generations of McAllister ranches, the money felt less like opportunity than like temptation. Blood money, his mother might have called it. Payment for betraying everything the family had built. A knock at the front door interrupted his brooding. Through the window, he could see Martha's truck parked in the driveway. The woman herself, standing on the porch with a covered dish in her hands and determination written across her weathered face. "Brought you some stew," she announced when he opened the door. "Figure a man living alone needs proper nutrition, especially when he's got big decisions weighing on his mind. Word travels fast. Word travels at the speed of light when it involves $12 million and the future of every family in this valley." Martha pushed past him into the kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd been making herself at home in this house for decades. That courier didn't exactly keep quiet about his delivery. She began unpacking containers with practiced efficiency, filling the kitchen with aromas that carried Elias back to childhood dinners and community gatherings. Martha had been cooking for half the county since before he was born, her recipes passing through generations like heirloom jewelry. "I suppose you think I should turn it down," Elias said, settling at the kitchen table where he'd eaten breakfast every morning of his first 18 years. "I think you should do what's right for you," Martha replied, ladling stew into bowls. "But I also think you should understand what accepting that offer would mean for the rest of us." She joined him at the table, and they ate in comfortable silence for several minutes. The stew was everything he remembered. Rich, hearty, seasoned with herbs Martha grew in her own garden. Food made with the kind of care that spoke of genuine affection for the people who would eat it. "Tell me about this development company," Elias said finally. Martha's expression darkened. "Apex, they're what happens when money decides it's more important than people. Started in Colorado, turned half of Aspen into a playground for billionaires. Now they're moving north, looking for the next scenic valley they can transform into profit. And if they get their hands on this ranch, 5 years from now, this whole valley will be unrecognizable. Golf courses where cattle used to graze, McMansions where hayfields used to grow, service jobs for the locals who can't afford to live here anymore, buzzing tables for rich folks from back east who come out here to play cowboy on weekends." Elias pushed the stew around his bowl, appetite fading as he contemplated the future Martha was describing. "Maybe change isn't always bad. Maybe some development could help the local economy." "Help who?" "Tom Bradley's been ranching his family's land for 40 years, but his property taxes have doubled since Apex started buying. Jim Morrison's son wanted to stay and take over the cattle operation, but he can't afford to compete with development wages for his hired hands." Martha's voice carried decades of frustration with economic forces beyond her control. "This isn't progress, Elias. It's displacement dressed up in pretty words." After Martha left, Elias walked the boundaries of his father's land as evening painted the mountains purple and gold. The ranch encompassed nearly 3,000 acres, from the river bottom, where the richest pastures grew, to the hillsides, where Duncan had established windbreaks and conservation areas. Every fence post, every irrigation ditch, every building represented decisions made by men who'd planned for generations, rather than quarterly profits. His phone rang as he stood beside the old windmill his grandfather had installed in 1942. The caller ID showed a Denver area code. "Mr. McAllister, this is David Chen from Apex Development. I hope you received our offer." The voice was smooth, professional, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I did. Excellent. I know it's a substantial figure, but I want to assure you that we're prepared to move quickly. Cash transaction, no financing contingencies, close within 30 days. We understand the emotional attachment to family property, and we're willing to pay appropriately for it. And what would you do with the land once you owned it?" Chen's tone became enthusiastic, as if he were describing a gift to humanity rather than a business transaction. "We're planning a world-class resort community. Golf course designed by Tom Fazio. Luxury accommodations, conference facilities, maybe even a small airstrip for private aircraft. It would bring hundreds of jobs to the area, significant tax revenue, real economic development. What about the ranching families who've been here for generations?" "Change is never easy, Mr. McAllister, but it's inevitable. The agricultural economy in this region is struggling. We're offering a path toward prosperity that benefits everyone." Elias ended the call without making any commitments, but Chen's words lingered in his mind like smoke from a grass fire. Change was inevitable, that much was probably true. The question was whether it would be change that honored the past while building a sustainable future, or change that swept away everything valuable in pursuit of immediate profit. That night, he sat on the porch where his parents had spent countless evenings, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain air and listening to the sounds of night settling over the valley. Somewhere in the darkness, generations of McAllister dreams were buried in this soil. Somewhere beyond the mountains, forces of capital and development were planning the transformation of everything those dreams had built. The letter from Apex Development lay on the table beside him, its $12 million promise both solution and temptation. In 30 days, he would need to choose between honoring his father's legacy and securing his own future, between community responsibility and personal freedom, between the known weight of staying and the unknown possibilities of leaving. His dog dozed at his feet, content to be wherever its master was, trusting that whatever decision came, they would face it together. The discovery came by accident, as many important revelations do. Elias had been cleaning out his father's desk, sorting through decades of ranch records and correspondence, when he found the folder wedged behind the bottom drawer. It was thick with documents, legal papers, and what appeared to be geological surveys dating back 15 years. At first, the technical language and scientific diagrams made little sense to him. But as he read more carefully, a picture began to emerge that changed everything he thought he understood about Apex Development's interest in his land. The surveys had been commissioned by Duncan McAllister in 2010, apparently in response to rumors about mineral deposits in the region. What they revealed was extraordinary: a significant lithium deposit running directly beneath the McAllister Ranch, with estimated reserves that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars in today's market. Lithium, the metal that powered electric car batteries, solar panels, and the entire green energy revolution. The same metal that was driving mining booms across the American West and making overnight fortunes for anyone lucky enough to own the right piece of ground. Elias sat back in his father's chair, the implications crashing over him like a wave. Apex Development wasn't interested in building a luxury resort. They were after something far more valuable: mineral rights that his father had apparently discovered and then kept secret for over a decade. But why? Why would Duncan sit on information worth this kind of money? The answer came in a letter buried deeper in the folder, written in his father's careful handwriting and dated just 2 months before Duncan's death. "If anyone reads this, it means I'm gone, and the decision about the lithium deposit falls to whoever inherits this ranch. I've kept this discovery quiet for 15 years because I've seen what mining does to communities, to families, to the land itself. The money would be enormous, enough to make our family wealthy for generations. But at what cost? They've watched strip mining destroy whole valleys in Wyoming and Colorado. I've seen communities torn apart by the boom and bust cycle that follows mineral extraction. Most of all, I've seen good agricultural land poisoned by chemicals and scarred by machinery, never to be productive again. This ranch has been in our family for 4 generations. 4 generations of McAllisters have worked this soil, raised cattle on these pastures, drawn water from these wells. Are we willing to destroy all of that for money we don't really need? I know what I should do: file the claims, lease the mineral rights, take the millions that any sensible businessman would grab without hesitation. But every time I think about it, I imagine your great-great-grandfather Thomas McAllister, who homesteaded this land in 1884. He didn't break his back clearing fields and building fences so his descendants could strip mine the legacy he left them. The decision is yours now, son. Whatever you choose, I'll understand. But remember that some kinds of wealth come at too high a price, Elias read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of his father's wisdom and torment. Duncan McAllister had carried this secret for 15 years, wrestling with the temptation of enormous wealth while trying to preserve something more valuable than money. The sound of vehicles outside drew his attention away from the documents. Through the window, he could see 2 black SUVs pulling up to the house, their tinted windows and city license plates marking them as outsiders. This wasn't another visit from concerned neighbors. This had the look of serious business. David Chen climbed out of the lead vehicle, accompanied by a woman in an expensive suit and 2 men who had the bearing of professional security. They approached the house with the confident stride of people who were accustomed to getting what they wanted through a combination of money and pressure. Elias met them on the front porch, the folder of geological surveys tucked under his arm. His dog took a position beside him, alert but not aggressive, reading the tension in its master's posture. "Mr. McAllister," Chen said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. We were in the area and thought we might discuss our offer in person." "Actually, I do mind," Elias replied calmly. "This is private property, and I didn't invite you here." The woman stepped forward, extending a business card with manicured fingers. "I'm Rebecca Walsh, senior partner at Walsh & Associates. We represent Apex Development's legal interests in this region. Perhaps we could come inside and discuss some matters of mutual concern." "What matters would those be?" Chen's smile faded slightly. "Mr. McAllister, we know about the geological surveys your father commissioned. We know about the lithium deposit. And we know that mineral extraction represents a far more profitable use of this land than cattle ranching ever could." The confirmation of his suspicions hit Elias like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." "Please," Walsh said with professional patience. "Let's not play games. Apex has been researching this property for 2 years. We know about the 2010 surveys. We know about the estimated reserves. And we know that your father chose to sit on one of the most valuable lithium deposits in North America rather than develop it properly." One of the security men stepped closer, a subtle but unmistakable escalation that made Elias's dog growl low in its throat. "Here's what's going to happen," Chen continued, his tone hardening. "You're going to accept our $12 million offer, or we're going to make this situation very complicated for you. Mineral rights law is complex, Mr. McAllister. There are ways to challenge property ownership, especially when significant public resources are involved. Are you threatening me?" "We're explaining reality," Walsh replied smoothly. "Lithium is a strategic national resource. The federal government has significant interest in ensuring that deposits of this magnitude are developed efficiently. Environmental impact studies, regulatory reviews, legal challenges to property titles. These processes can take years and cost millions in legal fees." Elias felt anger building in his chest, the same hot fury that had driven him from this ranch 30 years ago. But now it wasn't directed at his father's expectations. It was focused on these strangers who thought money gave them the right to destroy everything his family had built. "Or," Chen added, "you can accept our generous offer, avoid all of those complications, and walk away with enough money to live comfortably anywhere in the world. We're not unreasonable people, Mr. McAllister. We're simply business people who recognize opportunity when we see it." "Get off my property," Elias said quietly. The security men tensed, but Walsh gestured for them to remain calm. "Mr. McAllister, I urge you to consider the consequences of your decision carefully. Apex Development has resources you can't imagine. We can make your life very difficult if you choose to be uncooperative." I said, "Get off my property." Chen nodded to his companions, and they began walking back toward their vehicles. But he paused at the edge of the porch, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something harder and more calculating. "You have 72 hours to reconsider our offer, Mr. McAllister. After that, we'll explore other options for acquiring this land. I assure you, those alternatives will be far less pleasant for everyone involved." After they left, Elias stood on the porch for a long time, watching their dust settle on the road that led back to town. The folder of geological surveys felt heavier in his hands, weighed down by the knowledge of what lay beneath his feet and the forces that knowledge had unleashed. He walked back inside and spread the documents across his father's dining room table, studying them with new understanding. The lithium deposit was even more extensive than he'd first realized, stretching beneath not only his ranch, but also portions of the surrounding properties. Tom Bradley's land, Jim Morrison's spread, even parts of the old mining claims on Copper Ridge, all of it sitting on top of a mineral fortune that would transform the entire valley. No wonder Apex had been buying up properties throughout the region. They weren't just after his ranch. They were assembling a lithium mining empire, one carefully researched acre at a time. The resort story was just cover, a way to acquire land without revealing their true intentions until they controlled enough territory to make extraction profitable. His father's letter lay beside the geological surveys, its warnings about the cost of certain kinds of wealth taking on new urgency. Duncan McAllister had faced this same choice 15 years ago and chosen preservation over profit. Now that decision, and all of its consequences, belonged to his son. But Elias was no longer facing this challenge alone. Apex Development had just made their first serious mistake. They'd revealed their hand and shown their willingness to use threats and intimidation. In doing so, they'd transformed a personal decision about inheritance into something much larger, a fight for the soul of an entire community. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Sheriff Dorsey's voice came through with unusual tension. "Elias, we need to talk. There's been some developments you should know about. Can you meet me in town?" "What kind of developments?" "The kind that suggest you're not the only one who's discovered what's really under your ranch." The emergency meeting convened in Martha's saloon after closing time, with the blinds drawn and the front door locked. Word had spread through the community with the speed that only crisis could generate, and by 9 o'clock, nearly every rancher, business owner, and long-time resident in the county had crowded into the modest establishment. Sheriff Dorsey stood beside the bar, his expression grim as he addressed the assembled group. "I received some disturbing information this afternoon from a contact at the state level. Apex Development has filed preliminary paperwork with the Bureau of Land Management, claiming mineral exploration rights on over 15,000 acres in this valley." A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. Tom Bradley rose from his chair, his weathered face flushed with indignation. 15,000 acres? That's nearly half the productive ranch land in the county, including property they don't even own yet, Jim Morrison added. His voice tight with controlled fury. Harold Stevens cleared his throat nervously. "I've been researching their legal strategy, and it's more sophisticated than we initially understood. They're claiming that lithium extraction serves the national interest in energy independence. Under current federal law, that gives them significant leverage in challenging private property rights." Doc Miller leaned forward from her position near the window. "What kind of leverage?" "Eminent domain proceedings, for starters. If they can demonstrate that mineral extraction serves a compelling public purpose, they can petition federal courts to force land sales at prices they determine to be fair market value." "What they determine to be fair?" Martha's voice carried decades of skepticism about government fairness. "I've seen how that works. Fair to them means whatever keeps their profit margins healthy." Elias had been listening from a corner table, the folder of geological surveys spread before him like evidence in a criminal trial. Now he stood and the room fell silent as every eye turned toward him. "There's more you all need to know," he said quietly. "My father discovered this lithium deposit 15 years ago. He kept it secret because he understood what would happen if word got out. He passed around copies of the geological surveys, watching faces change as people absorbed the magnitude of what lay beneath their feet. The numbers were staggering, enough lithium to supply a significant portion of America's battery manufacturing needs for decades. Duncan knew. Tom Bradley's voice carried a mixture of surprise and respect. All these years, he knew we were sitting on a fortune, and he never said a word. He was protecting us, Elias replied, sharing his father's letter with the group. He understood that this kind of money brings a different kind of problem, the kind that destroys communities instead of building them. As the letter passed from hand to hand, expressions shifted from anger to something deeper, a recognition that they were facing forces larger and more ruthless than anything they'd previously encountered. Martha wiped down a glass with mechanical precision, her movements betraying the tension she felt. So what do we do? Roll over and let them strip mine our valley? Pack up and move somewhere else so city folks can get rich off our land? We fight, Sheriff Dorsey said simply. But we need to understand what we're up against. Apex Development isn't some small-time operation. They have lawyers, lobbyists, and enough capital to outlast most legal challenges. Doc Miller stood up, her medical bag in hand as if she were making rounds. I've seen mining operations in other parts of Montana. The environmental damage alone should be enough to stop them. Lithium extraction uses enormous amounts of water and toxic chemicals. It would contaminate our aquifer for generations. Environmental concerns don't carry much weight when national security gets involved, Harold Stevens observed grimly. The federal government has been pushing domestic mineral extraction as a strategic priority. Clean energy, reducing dependence on foreign sources, it's hard to argue against that kind of rhetoric. Elias walked to the window and looked out at the main street of Bitter Ridge, its quiet buildings bathed in moonlight. In 30 years of mountain solitude, he'd forgotten how communities could come together in times of crisis, how individual concerns could merge into collective determination. There might be another way, he said, turning back to face the group. What if we beat them at their own game? How do we do that? Tom Bradley asked, by controlling the extraction ourselves. Instead of letting Apex strip mine the valley, we form our own cooperative. Sustainable mining practices, environmental protections, profits shared among the community members. The suggestion sparked immediate debate. Some saw it as capitulation to forces they should resist entirely. Others recognized it as potentially the only way to maintain some control over their own destiny. Jim Morrison stood up, his expression thoughtful. It's not a crazy idea. Agricultural cooperatives have been working in this region for decades. Why not mineral extraction cooperatives? Because mining is different from farming, Martha replied sharply. You can't unscar land that's been strip-mined. You can't unpoison water that's been contaminated with processing chemicals. But we could do it right, Doc Miller said slowly, warming to the concept. Environmental controls, restoration requirements, limits on extraction rates. If we're going to lose our agricultural way of life anyway, maybe we can at least protect the land for future generations. Sheriff Dorsey nodded thoughtfully. The legal framework exists for community-controlled resource development. Several towns in Wyoming and Colorado have formed similar arrangements for natural gas extraction. Elias felt the weight of decision pressing down on his shoulders. His father had carried this burden alone for 15 years, wrestling with choices that affected not only his family, but an entire community. Now that same weight was his to bear. I need to know something, he said, addressing the room. If I refuse Apex's offer, if I commit to keeping this ranch and fighting for community control of any mineral extraction, are you all willing to stand with me? Because this won't be easy. They have resources we don't, and they've already shown they're willing to play rough. The response was immediate and unanimous. Hands raised, voices called out agreement, and the energy in the room shifted from worried concern to determined resolve. These were people who'd weathered economic downturns, natural disasters, and social changes that had destroyed other rural communities. They weren't about to surrender without a fight. Tom Bradley spoke for the group. Elias, your family has been part of this valley for 4 generations. We've all watched you grow up, seen you leave, and now we're watching you come home. If you're willing to stay and fight for this place, then we'll stand with you. Martha began serving coffee to anyone who wanted it, her movements quick and efficient despite the late hour. So what's our first step? How do we take on a development company with more money than God? Harold Stevens opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of legal documents. We start by understanding our rights and filing protective paperwork. Property deed confirmations, water rights documentation, environmental impact concerns. Anything that creates legal obstacles to their expansion plans. And we document everything, Sheriff Dorsey added. Their visits, their threats, their attempts to pressure property owners. If this goes to court, we'll need evidence of their tactics. Doc Miller stood near the door, her expression serious but determined. I'll research the health impacts of lithium mining, document the medical concerns for our community. If they want to poison our land, they'll have to answer for the consequences to human health. As the meeting began to break up, individuals and small groups continued discussing strategy and sharing information. The crisis had awakened something in the community, a sense of shared purpose that had been dormant during the years of economic decline and gradual exodus of young people. Elias remained behind after most of the others had left, helping Martha clean glasses and stack chairs. The saloon felt different now, charged with the energy of people who decided to fight for something they valued more than money. Your father would be proud, Martha said quietly, wiping down the bar with practiced strokes. He always believed this community was worth preserving, even when times got hard. He carried this secret for 15 years. That must have been a terrible burden. Duncan McAllister was the strongest man I ever knew, Elias, but even strong men need help sometimes. He tried to protect us by carrying that burden alone, but maybe it's better that you don't have to. Sheriff Dorsey approached them, his hat in his hands, and worry etched across his weathered features. Elias, I need to tell you something. That phone call I mentioned earlier, it came from a friend at the State Attorney General's office. Apex has retained some very expensive legal talent. They're not planning to wait much longer for your decision. How long do we have? Days, not weeks. They're filing for preliminary mineral exploration permits this Friday. Once those go through, they'll have legal grounds to conduct surveys and testing on your property, whether you agree or not. The weight of approaching deadlines settled over them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Whatever decision Elias made, whatever strategy the community pursued, they would need to move quickly and decisively. As he drove home through the quiet darkness, Elias reflected on how much his life had changed in just 2 weeks. He'd returned to Bitter Ridge as a solitary mountain man, seeking closure with his past. Now he found himself at the center of a battle that would determine the future of an entire valley. His dog dozed in the passenger seat, trusting that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. That trust, Elias realized, was what the community was offering him as well, the chance to be part of something larger than individual survival, something worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. The ranch house stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its windows dark but welcoming. Inside, his father's desk held the geological surveys that had started everything, and his father's letter that explained the moral weight of the choices ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures, new attempts by Apex Development to force his hand. But tonight, for the first time since he'd returned home, Elias McAllister felt like he belonged exactly where he was. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the Montana mountains look close enough to touch. Elias stood on his front porch, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the sun paint the peaks gold and knowing this might be his last peaceful moment. For a long time, the phone had been ringing since dawn. Reporters from Denver and Billings who'd somehow gotten wind of the story, lawyers offering their services, and environmental groups wanting to discuss coalition strategies. Word about the lithium deposit and Apex Development's plans had leaked beyond the valley, transforming a local land dispute into a symbol of corporate versus community interests. Sheriff Dorsey's patrol car pulled into the driveway at exactly 8 o'clock, followed by Harold Stevens in his bank sedan and Tom Bradley in a pickup truck that had seen 30 years of honest work. The cavalry had arrived, though whether they were riding to victory or disaster remained to be seen. Ready for this? Clay asked as he climbed the porch steps. As ready as a man can be for something he never expected to face, Elias replied. Any word from your contact at the state level? Apex filed their preliminary permits at 6 this morning. They're not wasting time. Clay's expression was grim but determined. However, Harold here has some interesting news about their legal strategy. The banker opened his briefcase with the careful precision that had made him trusted throughout the county. I've been researching Apex Development's corporate structure, and there are some irregularities that might work in our favor. He spread documents across the porch table, like a card player revealing a winning hand. Apex is actually a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate that has significant investments in Chinese manufacturing, specifically companies that compete directly with American battery producers. Tom Bradley leaned forward, his weathered hands tracing the corporate ownership charts. What does that mean in plain English? It means that Apex Development is essentially acting as a front for foreign mineral extraction, Harold explained. They're planning to ship raw lithium overseas for processing, then sell finished batteries back to American companies at inflated prices. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. So they're not even pretending this serves national security interests. Worse than that, Clay added. If we can prove foreign ownership of a strategic mineral extraction operation, it opens up a whole different set of federal regulations. National security review processes, foreign investment restrictions, congressional oversight requirements. The implications hit Elias like a physical blow. His father's land, 4 generations of McAllister sweat and dreams, was being targeted not to serve American energy independence, but to enrich foreign competitors at the expense of domestic industry. How do we prove it? He asked. Harold smiled for the first time in days. That's where Martha's connections come in handy. Her nephew works for the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington. He's been tracing Apex's financial backing through shell companies and offshore accounts. Tom Bradley stood up, pacing the length of the porch with the restless energy of a man accustomed to action. So we have ammunition for a legal fight. But what about the immediate threat? Those permits they filed this morning? Clay checked his watch. The county commissioners are meeting at 10 to discuss approval of the exploration permits. Apex has requested expedited processing, claiming time-sensitive geological concerns. In other words, they want to start digging before we can organize effective opposition, Elias observed. Exactly. Which is why we need to be at that meeting with everything we have. Legal challenges, environmental concerns, proof of foreign ownership, community opposition. This is our chance to stop them before they gain a foothold. Martha's truck appeared on the horizon, raising dust as it approached the ranch house. She parked beside the other vehicles and climbed out with the purposeful energy that had made her a force in local politics for decades. "Boys," she called out, "I hope you're ready for a fight, because I just got off the phone with my nephew, and what he found about Apex Development's financing is going to make your head spin." She joined them on the porch, spreading printouts of financial documents that looked like hieroglyphics to Elias, but clearly meant something significant to Harold Stevens. Shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, with ultimate ownership traced back to Beijing Mineral Consortium, Martha announced with satisfaction. Apex Development is about as American as fortune cookies. The pieces of their defense strategy were falling into place, but Elias could feel the weight of approaching confrontation pressing down on his shoulders. In 2 hours, he would walk into a county commissioners' meeting and fight for the right to control his own family's land. The outcome would determine not only his personal future, but the fate of an entire community. "There's something else," he said, pulling his father's letter from his shirt pocket. "I want to read this at the meeting. I want people to understand that this isn't just about mineral rights or corporate profits. It's about what kind of legacy we leave for future generations." Clay nodded approvingly. "Your father's voice carries weight in this county, even from the grave. People remember Duncan McAllister as a man who kept his word and looked out for his neighbors." Tom Bradley checked his own watch. "We should head into town. Folks will be gathering early. And we want to make sure our people get seats before Apex's lawyers fill up the room. As they prepared to leave for what might be the most important meeting in Bitter Ridge's history, Elias took one last look across his family's land. 4 generations of McAllisters had worked this soil, raised families in these buildings, and built something worth preserving. Today, he would discover whether love of place could triumph over love of money, whether community solidarity could stand against corporate power, whether the values his father had died protecting could survive in a world that seemed to value only profit. The Bitter Ridge Community Center hadn't seen this many people since the high school state championship celebration 15 years ago. Every folding chair was occupied, with overflow crowds standing along the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. The air crackled with tension as neighbors who'd known each other for decades found themselves on opposite sides of an issue that would define their community's future. David Chen sat in the front row with Rebecca Walsh and a team of lawyers whose expensive suits stood out like exotic birds among the working clothes and Sunday best of the local residents. Behind them, scattered throughout the crowd, were faces Elias didn't recognize, likely Apex employees or consultants brought in to create the impression of broader support for the development project. The 3 county commissioners took their seats at the front table with the weary expressions of elected officials who'd suddenly found themselves at the center of a controversy far larger than anything their experience had prepared them to handle. Commissioner Janet Pierce, a retired teacher who'd served on the board for 8 years, called the meeting to order with a voice that betrayed her nervousness. This special session has been called to consider application 2025-47, filed by Apex Development Corporation, requesting expedited approval for mineral exploration permits on properties within County District 7, she announced, reading from prepared notes. The applicant has requested priority processing due to time-sensitive geological concerns. David Chen rose smoothly, his confidence undiminished by the hostile energy radiating from much of the crowd. Commissioners, thank you for accommodating our urgent timeline. Apex Development represents a significant opportunity for economic growth in this region, potentially creating hundreds of jobs and generating millions in tax revenue. He launched into a polished presentation complete with charts, graphs, and projections that painted lithium extraction as the salvation of Bitter Ridge's struggling economy. His words were carefully chosen, emphasizing job creation and economic development while glossing over environmental impacts and community disruption. The lithium deposits beneath this valley represent a strategic national resource. Jen continued, critical to America's energy independence and our transition to sustainable transportation. Apex Development is uniquely positioned to extract these minerals efficiently while maintaining the highest environmental standards. Commissioner Pierce nodded politely, though her expression suggested skepticism about the presentation's rosy optimism. Thank you, Mr. Chen. We'll now hear from community members who wish to comment on this application. Elias stood first, his father's letter in his hand and 30 years of mountain solitude behind him. The room fell silent as he walked to the podium, every eye tracking his movement. My name is Elias McAllister, he began, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the crowded room. 4 generations of my family have ranched the land that Apex Development wants to strip mine. Before I share my thoughts, I'd like to read you something my father wrote before he died. He unfolded Duncan's letter and began reading the words that had waited months for this moment. As his father's voice filled the room through his son's recitation, the crowd grew increasingly still. Duncan McAllister's reputation for honesty and wisdom lent weight to every phrase, every warning about the true cost of certain kinds of wealth. When he finished, Elias looked up to see tears in Martha's eyes and grim determination on the faces of his neighbors. My father discovered this lithium deposit 15 years ago, he continued. He could have become one of the richest men in Montana, Instead, he chose to protect something more valuable than money, a way of life. A community, a landscape that has supported families for over a century. He pulled out the corporate ownership documents Harold had uncovered. But there's something else you need to know about Apex Development's true intentions. They're not an American company serving American interests. The revelation of Chinese ownership sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Chen's confident expression faltered for the first time as Elias detailed the foreign investment structure that would funnel American mineral wealth overseas. "This isn't about energy independence," Elias declared, his voice rising with controlled anger. "This is about foreign exploitation of American resources at the expense of American communities." Martha stood next, her silver hair gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. For 30 years, she'd served this community as both business owner and unofficial grandmother to half the county. When she spoke, people listened. "I've lived through boom and bust cycles before," she said simply. "Mining companies come in with big promises and fancy presentations. They extract what they want, ship the profits elsewhere, and leave us with poisoned water and scarred land. We've seen it in other parts of Montana, and we won't let it happen here." One by one, community members rose to speak. Tom Bradley talked about 4 generations of his family raising cattle on land that would be destroyed by open-pit mining. Doc Miller presented medical evidence about the health impacts of lithium processing chemicals. Jim Morrison spoke about the agricultural heritage that sustained communities long after mining companies moved on to their next target, but it was Harold Stevens who delivered the crushing blow to Apex's application. Standing with the quiet authority that came from 30 years of managing the community's financial interests, he presented documentation proving that Apex Development had misrepresented both their ownership structure and their environmental compliance record in other states. 3 major violations in Colorado, 2 in Wyoming, 1 pending lawsuit in Nevada, he read from official records. This company's environmental standards exist only in their marketing materials. David Chen tried to respond, but the crowd's anger was building towards something that felt dangerous. Commissioner Pierce called for order repeatedly as voices rose and accusations flew across the packed room. Finally, she called for a recess so the commissioners could deliberate privately. As the crowd spilled outside, Elias found himself surrounded by neighbors offering support and strangers asking questions he couldn't answer. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since this crisis began, he felt like victory might be possible. 6 months later, Elias stood in the same spot on his front porch where Sheriff Dorsey had first confronted him as a stranger. The morning air carried the sweet scent of new grass and the distant sound of cattle calling to their calves, sounds that might never have returned. To the valley of Apex Development had succeeded in their plans. The county commissioners had voted unanimously to deny the mining permits that December morning, citing environmental concerns, foreign ownership issues, and overwhelming community opposition. David Chen and his legal team had threatened appeals and federal intervention. But their threats had proven hollow once congressional investigators began examining Apex's ties to Chinese mineral interests. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of foreign companies using American subsidiaries to extract strategic resources from public and private lands throughout the West. Apex Development became a poster child for regulatory reform, and their other projects faced similar scrutiny in Colorado and Wyoming. But the real victory, Elias reflected, wasn't in stopping Apex. It was in what the community had built together in response to the threat. The McAllister Ranch was thriving again. With help from neighbors and a sustainable agriculture loan from Harold Stevens Bank, Elias had restocked the pastures with cattle and hired 3 local men who might otherwise have left the valley seeking work. The old windmill his grandfather had installed was pumping water again, and the hayfields showed the first promising growth they'd seen in years. More importantly, the crisis had awakened something in Bitter Ridge that many had thought was lost forever. The community that had rallied to fight apex development discovered they could accomplish other things together as well. Martha's Saloon had become an unofficial meeting hall for the agricultural cooperative they'd formed, sharing equipment and expertise among smaller ranchers who couldn't afford modern machinery individually. Doc Miller had established a rural health clinic that served not only Bitter Ridge but 3 surrounding counties. Funded partly by a federal grant she'd pursued with characteristic determination. Tom Bradley and Jim Morrison had started a sustainable beef program that marketed their cattle directly to restaurants in Billings and Bozeman, eliminating middlemen and increasing profits for participating ranchers. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew Elias's attention to the road. Sheriff Dorsey's patrol car turned into the driveway, followed by a familiar pickup truck that belonged to Martha. It was their monthly meeting to discuss community security and coordination, a tradition that had grown out of their shared experience, fighting apex development. Morning. Elias, Clay called out as he climbed the porch steps. Thought you'd want to know. We got final word from the State Attorney General's office. Apex Development has officially withdrawn all pending applications in Montana and dissolved their American operations. Martha emerged from her truck carrying a basket that undoubtedly contained fresh coffee cake and enough news to fill the morning. And Beijing Mineral Consortium is facing congressional hearings about their land acquisition activities, she added with satisfaction. Seems our little fight here opened up a much bigger investigation. They settled into the comfortable routine of friends who'd weathered serious challenges together. The dog, now completely at home on the ranch, took its customary position beside Elias's chair and dozed in the morning sunshine. Any regrets about the money? Clay asked, referring to the millions Elias had turned down by refusing Apex's offer. Elias considered the question seriously. The lithium deposit remained beneath his land, and its value continued to increase as electric vehicle production expanded worldwide. Environmental groups had approached him about sustainable extraction methods, and university researchers wanted to study low-impact mining techniques on his property. Sometimes I think about what my father went through, carrying that secret for 15 years, he replied. The weight of knowing you're sitting on a fortune while watching your neighbors struggle financially. But I understand now why he made the choice he did. Martha poured coffee from her thermos, the ritual as familiar as the sunrise. Duncan always said that some things were worth more than money. Took his son 30 years to come home and figure out what he meant. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Elias had fled this ranch as a young man to escape the weight of family expectations and community obligations. Now at 52, he'd voluntarily taken on both, along with responsibilities his father had carried alone. The Harper place went up for sale yesterday, Clay mentioned casually. Family's moving to Colorado for his wife's job. Thought you might be interested. It's adjacent to your south pasture. Elias nodded thoughtfully. The ranch was profitable again, but growth required careful planning and consideration of long-term sustainability rather than short-term profit. It was the kind of decision his father would have appreciated, measured, responsible, focused on building something lasting rather than extracting maximum immediate value. I'll take a look at their asking price, he said. If the numbers work, it might make sense to expand the cattle operation. As the morning warmed and their coffee grew cold, the 3 friends discussed the small details that made up the daily business of community life. Water rights, road maintenance, the upcoming county fair, plans for a new fire station that would serve the eastern part of the valley. Ordinary concerns that had taken on new significance in the wake of their shared struggle against outside forces. When Martha and Clay finally left, Elias walked the boundaries of his land as he did most evenings, checking fences and water sources, observing the health of his cattle and the condition of his pastures. The routine grounded him in the immediate reality of ranch life while connecting him to the generations of McAllisters who'd walked these same paths. His father's letter rested in a frame on the kitchen table now, Its words, a daily reminder of the wisdom that came from choosing preservation over profit, community over individual gain. Duncan McAllister had been right about pride being an expensive luxury, but he'd also been right about some things being worth more than money. As the sun set behind the mountains that ringed the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that no amount of wealth could purchase, Elias McAllister stood on the land that had shaped 4 generations of his family and felt, for the first time in 30 years, that he was exactly where he belonged. The dog brushed against his legs, content to be anywhere its master was, trusting in the permanence of home and the enduring value of loyalty. Together, they watched the stars emerge in the clear mountain air, guardians of a legacy that would endure long after the last mining company had moved on to easier targets. Sometimes the most important victories weren't about what you gained, but about what you refused to lose.